We are on the frontiers of a new science. We're all starting to awaken to truths about who we are and where we're going. Open yourself to new knowledge about the power of spiritual energy and consciousness. Journey with Donna Smith-Moncrieffe as she takes you through the world of mediumship, energy healing, out-of-body experiences, past life regression, and all topics that demonstrate evidence of the true nature of our reality.
Welcome to On the Frontiers of a New Science. I am the host, Donna Smith-Moncrieffe, and on today's show, we have with us Mark Ireland. Mark is the author of Soul Shift, Finding Where the Dead Go, and Messages from the Afterlife. In these great books, he shares personal accounts of his quest for answers about life after death, subsequent to the passing of his youngest son. He is also the son of renowned psychic Richard Ireland. Welcome, Mark. So wonderful to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me here. I'm excited about this.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I can recall learning about you and your work in your first book, Soul Shift, Finding Where the Dead Go. And one of the things I was intrigued with is you didn't seem to be a believer in mediumship. So could you tell us, first off, what led you to believe that mental mediumship was real?
I actually was a believer. However, you had to, I guess the way the book framed up and with the editing process, the publisher wanted a little more tension in there. Okay. So while I was a believer in the phenomena, I wasn't a believer in all who practice it, and I know that, and I'm skeptical by nature, and that skepticism ties more to individuals to see if they're the real deal or not. But I'd say that really what strengthened my understanding of it. Early in my life, I was raised by a psychic medium, Richard Ireland, who was phenomenal. And to me, that was just kind of the standard of what a psychic or a medium would be. And most of the time in public venues, he demonstrated psychic phenomena first. But what really intrigued me were times when occasionally he would just pop into mediumship right in the middle of giving somebody messages and give very specific information such as first and last names and circumstances in the relationship to the person, whether it was an uncle, a son, a daughter, whatever.
Yes.
And so it really touched me as a kid seeing that, and then made me just feel like, okay, there really is more. I can't see it. I don't know where it is or how this works, but you could just tell it was real. And then knowing my dad and the way it was living in the house with him where you couldn't get away with anything and he was always alert to everything going on.
Right.
I knew my dad was the real deal. So having a father like that was really the best way for someone who's basically skeptical to come to understand and accept that as a real phenomena. However, what the book does accurately portray is I had my own path in life, and it wasn't really down this same one as my father. It was more of the practical, American path of getting a college degree and getting married, having kids, and going into the work world and being successful and all that. So I kind of went that way, maybe partially to be my own person, but I was pulled back when my son Brandon passed in 2004, and that really reinvigorated my interest in the field, and it set me on a new course in life, really, where I became kind of an explorer like you, but just with a background where that was already part of my lineage. And to kind of go out and explore and look at some other mediums on my own.
Yes. Now let's get into there. And of course, I can remember reading your book, and just my heart always goes out to you for your loss. We have to recognize that, but we can't help but think, obviously, that with your son's passing, it opened you up to a greater journey. For those of our listeners that may not have read this wonderful book, could you take us through that journey of searching for where the dead go with some of the mental mediums? What did they tell you that made you think perhaps this is real? And if I can just say, qualify that a bit more, of course you said you grew up with your father knowing that it was real, but now there's so much more at stake in understanding potential communication with those who have passed. What did they say to you to make you believe?
Well, really the first one was my uncle, who was still here on the earth at the time. He's since passed, but he was probably the next best psychic medium to my dad that I've ever met. And so I talked to him within hours of Brandon passing, and he asked if he could do anything for me, and I just said, well, if you can get anything at all that you can share about Brandon's well-being, I would really appreciate it. It was 2 days later that we spoke. I was on my cell phone in the mortuary making arrangements, and he said, Mark, I have something to share with you. And then he went on to tell me that he had tried to meditate the night before to connect, but he couldn't get anything. But that morning he had meditated, and my father came to him. And I asked a lot of detailed questions like, okay, he came to you, what does that mean, or you saw him?
Yes.
And he told me, and this is the level of my father and uncle's mediumship, it's beyond what I've heard from other mediums, but he said he could see my father clearly, just like standing there, and the talk is just like me talking to you.
Right.
Most mediums don't communicate at that level, but he said that my father had visited him before, but it had been quite a while since my dad passed, and my dad had been gone, I think at that point it was 12 years.
12 years.
And he said, but in this particular case, my father came to him and said that when Brandon passed, he was there waiting for him, and that at first Brandon was confused, but that he helped him adjust and then helped him cross over, and that Brandon wanted us to know we were the best parents he ever could have had, which is the sentimental thing you'd like to hear, and we appreciated. But what he gave us along with that was a piece of evidence that I was later able to validate. And my uncle said my father relayed to him that Brandon's death was caused by a lack of oxygen in the bloodstream that had caused his heart to fail. And it was just a few days after that I spoke to the physician who had performed the autopsy, and I was told that Brandon had suffered a severe asthma attack that dropped his blood oxygen levels, causing his heart to fail.
Let's just pause there for a second and take this all in. So some of the pieces of evidence that came to you, let's just go back to your father being seen, which we would call direct clairvoyance. Did any other family member tell you, I mean, you said your father was gone for 12 years. Did any other family member tell you, for example, that they'd seen him, or did he make himself appear for this very important time to let you know Brandon was okay?
You know, I don't know that anyone in the family had said that they'd seen my father appear in that way. My uncle was very gifted, like my father, so he was the natural candidate. And, of course, with the timing, I'm sure that my father wanted to comfort me at a time when my family and I needed it. So that's kind of what I felt had taken place.
Right. And then hearing about the evidence regarding the lack of oxygen, did that just blow you away?
Yeah, I mean, that was really, for me, the clincher, because it's not just a feel-good thing, but along with that you get a verifiable piece of evidence. And that was really meaningful to me and my family. Of
course. Now, again, of course, you go further in your journey about the mental mediums that you met. Now, again, let's just step back for the listeners. Would you have ever consulted with a mental medium before Brandon passed?
Sure, I would have. I mean, I didn't really have a need to necessarily to reach out to my dad, although he had passed and I missed him. It wasn't like something that I felt strongly drawn to, although I had been to some psychics. And that was more for, just personal advice, and because I was used to that, because my dad was one. Most of the readings he did were actually psychic readings more than mediumship readings, because people would come to him for direction. Yes. But I met with some top... Go ahead.
Yeah, and not to digress, but for our listeners, I've looked at some of your father's work on your website, Richard Ireland, and it's not like any psychic stuff that I've seen in the 21st century. It's just fantastic, almost really quite unbelievable, and good for you to be here to confirm with us that it was absolutely genuine. But not to take you off the track of talking to, so you never really, it was sort of more for entertainment. But after your son passed, there seemed to have been a systematic journey of going to specific mediums. Can you give us an example of a medium who you consulted, and tell us the kind of information that was validating that your son, in fact, was still very much with us in the spirit world?
Sure. I'll give you a few, just kind of roam around. The first one that I met with was actually Alison Dubois before she became famous because of the show Medium.
Right.
And the way that happened was rather interesting. I was watching the news about a month after Brandon had passed, and there was a clip about a research study being done at the University of Arizona with mediums under blinded conditions. And the medium they showed was Alison Dubois. And the clips they showed, she was very specific and really down to earth. I thought, wow, I'd really like to have a reading from her, and I'd love to be in that lab. Well, little did I know that both things were going to happen. The very next day, I received a phone call from a man named Jerry Concert, who had been friends with my father. And he said, Mark, I know what you've been through, and I know someone who might be able to help you. Her name's Alison Dubois, and here's a phone number you can call to get an appointment. So that was rather synchronous.
Synchronicity for sure.
And in my reading with Alison, there was a number of things that were shared. One, had to do with the heaviness of chest and breathing. And then she'd even said, hey, I think your son has to be careful near the water. I feel like I'm drowning. And then when I explained that situation, it became clear that she felt the heaviness of Brandon's breathing on that day. And the autopsy physician had also told me that when someone has either a severe asthma attack or drowning, the lungs expand in an effort to capture more oxygen, and they basically touch in the middle, and that had happened with Brandon. So the byproduct of that asthma attack was kind of the same thing as drowning, unfortunately.
Right.
But Alison shared that. She, in terms of my father, what was really remarkable was she said, now 2 weeks before this, I had met with someone who handed me a book that I was totally unaware of that my father had written with a ghostwriter 12 years earlier on psychic development.
Okay.
And I asked the guy, why are you giving this to me now after all these years? And he says, I don't know. I just feel like I'm supposed to.
Okay.
So 2 weeks later, I'm in this reading with Alison Dubois, and she goes, your father's showing me a book, and I believe it's his book, and he's handing it to you. It's for you to take forward. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, I knew what she meant. It was pretty wild.
Another piece of synchronicity right there.
Yeah.
So for the listeners, Mark, and some of our listeners probably have not experienced mediumship, so let's use that example of Alison Dubois. In this particular case, and I know that this was probably some of the work that was being done at the laboratory in Arizona, would this have been under strict testing? Would Alison have known any information about you prior? How was that all set up? Did she know your name? Just to help us understand what kind of protocols may have been around the testing.
So I was not tested in the lab with Alison. I was tested in the lab with Lori Campbell.
Okay.
With Alison, I had set it up myself, but I was very guarded and protective, and I know she knew only, my name and the fact that my dad was a psychic. She knew nothing about him. It's obvious she hadn't done any research on him because I had to educate her on him.
Okay.
And most of what she shared were things that were, there's no way she could research the thing about the book, and many other things that she shared as well. The Lori Campbell reading was different. That was actually filmed for Discovery Channel, and there's a clip of it on my website if people would like to see that.
Right.
But that was a situation where she didn't know who the sitter would be, and I was not allowed visual contact with her. I couldn't even speak, but the researcher asked the questions, and then she had to answer. And then at the end, we were finally able to have a dialogue, which was really nice. But she had a number of hits. I mean, one of the first things she said, she was asked, the deceased name is Brandon, and Brandon is the blank. Before it could even be said what it was, she said son. So she already knew son of the sitter. Can you tell me what was Brandon's cause of death? And she immediately said, my chest. I feel like my chest, like the air is just sucked out of it.
Wow. And
I feel like I want to throw up. Well, Brandon's best friend told me that Brandon threw up just before he passed out and then passed away.
Look at that.
And she went on to share a number of things. Like one other question was, can you tell me something about the sitter that would make him aware of that the deceased person is conveying to them that it's really him? And she's, amongst other things, she said, well, I feel like he's writing a book, and it's about his son, the deceased person. And that was exactly true. That's when I was putting the book Soul Shift together, and this was part of what I wanted to include in the book were some of the validation and the evidence that I could compile, especially from going to a lab like this.
Right, and let's sort of enlighten our listeners too about this. The hits are obviously first of all, in your opinion, they were very specific. As you said, they were things that couldn't have been searched because probably yourself and maybe your close family would have known. What's interesting was, again, you talked about not being in her, you weren't visible to her. So we do that, obviously, in some testing because some people believe, for example, that information can be obtained through what they call cold reading, through visual, through your nonverbal cues and that kind of thing. So you weren't even seen, you weren't even speaking, there was no information stated about you before, and this kind of detail came through. Another thing just to share with our listeners too, which is a common experience that mediums have, is sort of the clair empathy. You said that some of these mediums, sometimes it's not information, they're getting the information through what they're feeling. And a lot of the feeling that you're talking about seems to be validated from a number of mediums, the feeling that your son had just prior to death.
Right. That's true. And even one medium, Tina Powers, gave me what I felt was the best reading I've ever had. And in that session, this was the thing that was just the most touching thing that's ever happened. But she actually took on the persona of my son, and it was almost like the movie Ghost,
yes.
Where his personality is coming through, and she spoke in his sentence manner, the way he would have said something to me.
Wow.
And that was phenomenal. That's just another aspect of it that, isn't going to happen all the time, but a very good medium can do that too. And frankly, a few years ago, I've been encouraged by the mediums to try and develop my own abilities because I do come from that lineage.
Yes.
And what I found was in doing this, I actually have some ability. It's just that I'm not wild about doing it. I guess I'm too much of a control freak or too analytical, but when I would do it, it was interesting. I found two things that worked for me, and I was giving people specific information that really surprised them, but to me, in my mind, it was just speaking about something I visualized, and it seemed like such a simple, goofy thing to share, but yet it had meaning. But in one of these test sessions, I actually felt like the presence of this woman's deceased husband was almost like jumped into me or something.
Wow.
I know that sounds a little out there, but
yes.
It was like I was overshadowed by the emotions of this person at the time that they passed.
Right.
So that's another aspect that I think. So I think that's the only time that's happened to me, but I think that's what these mediums get when they feel these things, like the physical symptoms of different things that occur in the people who had passed. It was just interesting to have that feeling myself for once, rather than just hear about somebody else having it.
Absolutely, and I have heard as well from mediums that oftentimes it's actually better communication than trying for them to give you information about words and that kind of thing, because really we are energy, and the feeling is actually much more expressive. One of the things that I don't want to miss talking to you about as well, Mark, is I understand that you're doing some work in certifying mediums. What are some of the things that you would say, not only from your personal experience, but researching this area? Can you give our listeners an idea of some of the doubts that you may have had, or speak to some of the doubts we know people in general have about the ability to be able to communicate with those who are in the spirit world?
Well, the doubts, I guess, initially I was frustrated by the fact that no one could be 100% accurate. I guess I didn't understand it because I was so spoiled by the father I had.
Right.
Because it seemed like he was, although even he probably wasn't. I know that they had tracked some things that he had done over the years and rated him at 92% accurate on predictions and things like that. But
right.
I don't have documentation on that. But I saw how accurate he was, and I just never doubted anything he said. So these other mediums, they're not 90%. I mean, some, like the Lori Campbell reading may have been 85 to 90%, and the Tina Powers reading was up there, and some others. But in general,
I can remember at the conference that we were at in Arizona last year, Susan Geisman spoke about an interesting concept whereby she assessed her own reading, whereby, let's say, 60% of it was right at the time, but some of the information came later. And so when we're testing, we almost have to wait to see things unfold. Has that been something that you've been experiencing as well with your certification of mediums?
Well, not so much in the certifications, but I've seen that, because the certification process is fairly new, and I've just started it recently. I've certified 5 so far, but I've had a number of them not pass. I'd say less than 50% of them are passing right now.
Wow, okay.
Well, it's because I really want to make sure that the people that get on there are qualified. And even them, they have bad readings too. But I think, part of it is I've seen cases where something is said that hasn't happened yet, so you can't really measure it or weigh it.
Yes.
But the other thing is, too, I think from testing myself and trying this out in experiments, what I've come to understand is they're often relying on symbols or feelings or things like that, not like somebody shouting in their ear, hey, tell my Uncle Joe this or that. So therefore, they're trying to relay a piece of information, and they may not understand what it means.
That's
and if they relay it in a way that's not clear, or they allow their logical mind to take over, and instead of just freely relaying what they get, that can be the source of it too. So I've become a lot more, I guess, tolerant or understanding about that kind of thing. And so I think those two are definite factors. I'll give you an example that's pretty awesome about one. There's a medium out of Wisconsin, Molly Morningstar, who's a friend of mine now. And she was visiting us last February, I think it was. And she said, since you're putting me up, I would like to give you a reading. And so we said, great. And she gave us a number of messages from a variety of folks on the other side. And then she shifted to Brandon. Well, at this time, we were just a few months away. In May, my son, Stephen, Brandon's older brother, was going to get married in France.
Yes.
And so Molly had said, hey, Brandon's really excited about Stephen getting married, and he wants him to know that he's the real best man. Now, someone can stand in for him, but he's the real best man.
Okay.
And then she said, I think Stephen's going to have something. He's going to have something like a memento. It's going to be a small thing, and I think it could have a picture of Brandon in it. I think it'll have a little clip so it can go in his pocket and be seen. And remember 2 p.m. on the wedding day. So now fast forward to May, on the day of the wedding, a few hours before it takes place, when the groomsman comes to me with a box, and he said, hey, Mark, this is a gift from Liz. She couldn't make it. Now, Liz is a friend of both Brandon and Stephen, but she couldn't make the trip. So this is a gift for you, Stephen, and the groomsmen, and she wanted you to have this. I opened the box up, and it's filled with half a dozen small memento pins, each one that has a picture of Brandon in it and has a pin on it that you can stick in your pocket. And so we each wore these. And at 2 p.m., my wife, Susie, for the first time heard of this and saw it.
Isn't that incredible? So she was able to see that and would have obviously had no idea that was going to happen. You didn't know it was going to happen.
No, I'd actually forgotten about it until it actually happened. Then I thought, wait a minute, I think Molly said something, and I had a recording of it, which was great. So I actually went back and got verbatim what the recording it was.
Mm-hmm. And now, just again for our listeners, because I know this is another big doubt that some naysayers, but also some very good researchers talk about, is that information that some mediums can get either information from the mind or what we call the akashic records, sort of the universe. Where are you with that now, Mark?
I think, I can't prove that it's communication with a discarnate, but I lean that way. That's the way I think, and there's a number of reasons for that. The other explanations are more complex. I'm not saying there isn't an akashic record, and I'm not saying there isn't, well, I wouldn't call it super psi, but just psychic phenomena. My father actually would contend when he got information, it came from a variety of sources. So some of it was from discarnates, but some of it was through psychic means too. So did Molly shift gears? Maybe she was channeling Brandon, and then she picked that up on her own, or maybe he somehow helped link her to that information. Who's to say? It's hard to say for sure. I'd say the best evidence that I've seen, personally, is when people have actually seen discarnates. My wife has seen our son Brandon through her peripheral vision and felt him.
Right, I remember that in your book.
Yeah. Also, the cross-correspondence experiments, which you know about. I'm not going to get into that because it's too hard to explain and too long to explain.
Very complex, but excellent. You know, we can send a link for our listeners to that for sure.
The best single example, though, was this. You remember Deborah Martin, who you met in Scottsdale?
Yes, I do.
So Deborah's a really talented medium, and one day I was planning to meet her midday to review some, basically a preface I was writing for my dad's book, the psychic development book. And so before I got out there, I got an email from someone that lived in Sacramento. Her name's Linda. She was a coworker and a friend, and she said, I really need to talk to you. And I had just heard that her brother had been killed in a motorcycle accident. So I called her on my cell phone driving out to Deborah's house, and she had told me that her brother had died in this motorcycle accident. He'd been killed instantly, and he left behind some children. That's all she told me.
Right.
Then I had to hang up, and I said, I'll call you back later. I went to Deborah's house, and I said, it's amazing that I'm here today because we were here to talk about something else, but I was just on the phone with a friend whose brother had just died. And she said, well, it's no accident you're here because I need to talk to her. And so, and I said, do you want me to call her now? And she goes, no, let's do our business and then I'll figure it out later. So at the end of our discussion about my dad's book, I said, do you want to call her now? And she goes, no, I don't have enough time because I have to pick up my daughter, but let's sit down and see if I can connect with the brother. So we sat down, and she asked me, what's your friend's name? I said, Linda. She said, what's her brother's name? I said, I don't know. Within 5 seconds, she says, did this involve a motorcycle accident? I said, yes. And she said, well, the brother wants her to know that he died instantly. His soul left his body immediately. He felt no pain. And he's bringing up something about some kids. He says the little kids. So I get there's a sense of concern about the little kids. And he mentions also a little boy, separate from the little kids, and something about a red ribbon. So I think it's like a banner or a ribbon that went over his casket. And so I didn't know anything about these other things. And then she said, oh, and something pertaining to the kids with a bathtub or baths. So we were done, and I ended up then leaving and calling Linda on my drive back. And Linda obviously was thrilled that Deborah had been accurate about the motorcycle accident and that she felt her brother had not suffered. And the phrase, the little kids, she said that, well, when her brother, a few years earlier, her brother had a drug problem, so she and her husband had taken his children in, and they specifically called them the little kids. That was their phrase. And those kids enjoyed, their favorite activity was bath time. They would have water wars together. They put them all in the bathtub together at the same time.
Right.
Also, his motorcycle buddies had bought a red ribbon that adorned his casket. And then after that, there was a number of things that Deborah shared with her on a one-on-one call. But all of those things were things that I didn't know, and she couldn't read my mind.
Okay. So that's definitely, for you, that was convincing that this is likely a survival of consciousness. Definitely the personality, the memory, the soul of that brother speaking through.
What else could have connected her to that information without a roadmap? The only roadmap was an energetic roadmap.
Yeah. No, and I mean, going back to the way you responded to the initial question, I think it's an excellent answer. I think you're right. It's coming from different sources. I have often advocated that the akashic record is not really a rival theory. We do have a bank of information, but there are surviving souls that are able to communicate in different ways, and that they're not rival theories at all. One of the things, we're getting closer to the end of the show now. I know it's just gone, feels like we just got started. But one of the things I know is you've been very involved in helping other parents with grieving. And I think if you could say a few words about that organization and also about what you think about mental mediums working with parents who are grieving.
Sure. It's called Helping Parents Heal, and when people go to my website, markirelandauthor.com. There's a link to it there. So the way this started really was there's a woman named Elizabeth Boyson in Scottsdale who I became friends with. Her son had passed while ironically being in a mountain in the Himalayas due to altitude sickness. And she had started a local group to bring parents together to meet, and she invited me to speak at her very first meeting. There were probably 25, 30 people there.
Right.
And really, it was a very open session, and I felt like, some good could be done there. And I found out why she started this meeting, because she had been to, and I won't name the organization, but there are other very large ones that are very restrictive about what they allow parents to say or talk about. And we wanted, we both were interested in having open sharing about not just the grieving stuff, but about, people's evidence for their children's ongoing survival of consciousness and personality that would help heal. So from there, I suggested, it was a while later, but I kind of had this idea of taking the blueprint of what she had done and blowing it out and having affiliates throughout North America and someday worldwide.
Right.
And then just because she'd built the machine, we just needed to replicate it. And so we signed up affiliates. I think we have 20 now, and I think there's a couple in Canada too. One in Ontario and I think one in BC. I'd have to check.
So it's growing.
Yeah, we're growing. And so really what I've observed here and what we found is kind of the healing path that works for most people is 4 pillars. The first being support from family and friends, if it's available. Number 2, getting to know others who have been through the same thing and sharing experiences. And that group can serve to replace number 1 if somebody doesn't have number 1. The third one, being able to provide service to others when you're emotionally ready to do so. Because when you help others, it heals you too.
That's
and
right.
The fourth pillar, which really sets us apart, is that openness about being able to discuss signs, mediumship, other evidence for the afterlife, and even inviting mediums to our meetings and allowing them to do gallery readings. So I've just seen amazing healing take place because we've been fortunate enough to have good mediums come to those meetings and share impactful messages.
Yeah, and just one more question follow-up to that, and would you say, because I know I've heard some critics say, for example, that in healing, perhaps the medium is being replaced by a professional like a psychiatrist. I disagree with that, and I just wondered if you could make a comment about that.
Sure. I'm not suggesting that they be replaced, and I'm not suggesting people become medium junkies either, where they start getting readings all the time. This is just a bridge. It should be done once or twice a year, something like that. But Dr. Julie Beischel, who runs Windbridge, she's conducted a study on this and actually found that those two together, the therapy plus the access to a good medium, appears to be more healing than either one on its own, or especially, the therapy on its own. I got to be frank, I've met a lot of people who have been through therapy and didn't really improve. I think part of that is the therapist, because I've met some great therapists who helped immensely. But from my perspective, it's the hope element, because we live in such a cynical, skeptical world that's so materialistic that nothing's real unless you can touch it or feel it, or see it or hear it, that to get beyond that, for someone to actually have a piece of evidence that gives them hope is huge. And that's something a counselor can't give you.
And the evidence, plus you had mentioned already, Mark, the fact that when the discarnate is coming through, they're sometimes sharing, hey, I wasn't in the pain that you thought I was. And unfortunately, some people have gone through what we would physically see as a horrific death, yet they always say, I was in no pain. I was gone before the physical death. And I think, so the hope and just knowing that for some parents must be, as I said, just completely a relief. Now, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our show, but for our listeners, we're going to give you all the links we can to Mark. As you can see, he's done a lot of work in terms of research, also writing books, and we'll give you his links to this new organization that's helping so many parents address their grief. Mark, just remind us, though, about where they can contact you on Facebook.
Yeah, if you just go to my website, there's a link to my Facebook page on there. There's a link to the Helping Parents Heal site as well. And my website is markirelandauthor.com. It's Mark with a K, Ireland like the country, and author like author of a book, markirelandauthor.com.
Yes, and I really do encourage you all to read both of those books. Thank you so much, Mark, for being on the show. I am Donna Smith-Moncrieffe, and we have been talking with Mark Ireland about mental mediumship and the ability to communicate with our loved ones who have passed into the spirit world. If you would like to know more about topics related to consciousness and the nature of reality, visit our website at www.medium7.com to learn more. As we begin to identify the power of consciousness and explore inner power, we will create realities that we all dream about. Join us next week on the Frontiers of a New Science as we explore the relationship between extraterrestrials and the spirit realm, untapped area in the discussion of metaphysics and consciousness.
Join us each week as Donna Smith-Moncrieffe explores topics related to spiritual energy and consciousness. Collaborating with other experts, they will share evidence and ideas for you to integrate consciousness-based ideas into your life. For a